Welcome to the Redcaps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on a bit old school games. In today's episode, we are joined by Chris Gonnerman from the Basic Fantasy RPG project. I'd like you to remember, no mortal can outrun a redcap, so sit back, listen, and enjoy. This episode, we're not going to do a ton of preamble. Grab a nice beverage, sit back, and enjoy this conversation where you're going to get some really cool perspectives from one of the founders of the OSR movement, and there's some exclusive sneak peek stuff that you might get to hear as well as you're listening through. I do want to call attention again to the contest, the ongoing contest for your favorite child hero from fiction or history or pop culture. Drop me a voicemail. All the details will be down in the links below in the show notes. And drop me a note. Let me know what the favorite is and enter into the contest. There's some great prizes as well. If you wish to, there's a charity drive going on as well for Extra Life, which benefits the Sick Kids Hospital here in Toronto. Great causes. Please do participate. And now, Chris Gonnerman and the Basic Fantasy RPG project. Take it away. I am joined by Chris Gonnerman, who I'm going to call, I don't know how you'll feel about this term, but I'm going to call one of the fathers of the OSR because you were way back at the beginning of this whole thing, publishing the game that I recommend probably more than any other OSR game out there. It was the subject of episode 2 of this podcast. How you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing good.
So I was wondering if you could tell me, when I look at that game, the first thing that pops in my head is open source. I look at it almost as if it's being drawn as inspiration from, say, a Linux distribution, the way that you have the community set up, the way that contributions go. Is that a fair assessment, or is that something that's kind of just happened accidentally?
That's an absolutely fair assessment. It is my intention. It has always been my intention to run the Basic Fantasy project as an open source project. I have always welcomed, not necessarily everyone, but darn near everyone who actually wants to contribute. I have a wonderful team of rotating people, as it were. I don't always have the same team, but I have a wonderful team of people who work with me to produce our various products. So,
yeah, it's amazing. If you jump onto the forums on the Basic Fantasy RPG site, if you go there and just go through the forums, it's one of the few places I think that you'll find where there's regular discussions, like active community of discussions around the hobby, and everybody's polite. Everybody's super nice on those forums. And everybody seems to be kind of rowing in the same direction, so to speak. And I see people submitting stuff and there being feedback come back, and nobody seems to get bent out of shape. It's really a testament how cool of a little community you have built around that.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words.
I was wondering, one of the things I was thinking whenever I was looking to try to get hold of you and have you come on, and I don't know how much thought you've had on something like this, but how well the open source nature of the game has worked out. Is there any reason that you think there hasn't been a similar type project for a setting or / world? I was talking to somebody the other day, and was saying, when you look at worlds like Mystera or the Realms or any of these other settings, almost all of them were created before the year 2000, before, say, the common mainstream internet and all the super collaborative tools that we all have available to us now.
Yeah,
you don't see any of those type of worlds being created now. I think maybe Pathfinder's world, maybe, but outside of that, is there anything else that's
well? I'm gonna be honest with you right now. You made a comment to me much earlier about the OSR as an organization or a movement or whatever you want to say. I was there at the beginning, but I haven't really participated in very much of the rest of the OSR. I'm sorry to say this, not particularly interested in most everybody else's game systems. Not that there's anything wrong with them. If I had not invented Basic Fantasy, I would be playing Labyrinth Lord. Absolutely would be playing Labyrinth Lord. If Dan Proctor had gotten there before I did, then I would be playing Labyrinth Lord, and I would have changed things in it to be more like Basic Fantasy for obvious reasons. That Basic Fantasy is the way we played the game back in the day.
Right.
And I say we, I mean very literally the limited group of people that I knew personally who played games back in the day. So there's that. But absolutely, I don't follow the other games. Not that there's anything wrong with them; they're perfectly fine. And I do investigate games that are in the same playing field. I've been having a conversation with the fellow Gavin over at Necrotic Gnome about Old School Essentials. He's wanting to do a compatibility document, and we've been discussing that. I don't think it's premature to mention that. I think he has a very preliminary version of that on drive-through, but he was talking about getting more in detail and wanted to know how far he could go without treading on my toes, and we discussed that. It's not a big deal. But I don't generally follow the other games closely, so I don't know a lot about what's going on. I was surprised when I discovered, for example, that some parts of the OSR seem to have a lot of toxic people, because I don't see them. They don't hang out in our forum. We don't put up with those people. So
yeah, that's actually been a discussion as a lot of us have been getting ready for OSR October and talking about the OSR in general and the things that we wanted to highlight. A lot of us kind of had that same sentiment. It's like, we don't see the negative side that other people see of the OSR because it's not in the circles that we operate in. And another fellow podcaster said, well, that's great, but he goes, then what circles are you in, so that he could find out about it. And that's what kind of prompted me to go, well, I got to start pulling in some people to talk to that are from those areas, which is, how your name came up. Was that, you don't see this on, Basic Fantasy. Their forums are amazing. Everybody's there for the same thing. So I think those sorts of communities need to be highlighted a little bit more, rather than, I think, the echo chamber that some of the negative stuff gets. Nature of social media, just
sure.
Negative stuff floats to the top, whereas I think maybe
floats.
Yeah, you picked that up, did you? But yeah, it floats up to the top, as opposed to what maybe we should be lifting up and shining a light on. That actually, you answered one of my questions here, because I was going to ask you what you thought of the state of the OSR overall, and if you're not paying any attention to the other games, which I guess makes sense. You made a game that you like, so why wouldn't you be focusing?
Well, that's the first thing. There's a lot to do in the Basic Fantasy project, and I am constantly behind, and I know that's frustrating for many of the contributors, that when we get to the point where something is ready for uploading to the downloads page or for actual publication, it tends to drag somewhat before I get the time and I don't like the term spoons, but the energy to complete those things. The actual process of final production for printing isn't that demanding, but it's tedious, and I tend to shy away from the tedious things. But eventually we do it. We get it done. We get it out there. We've been doing this since 2006. The game's been around since then. I was OSR before there was a term OSR.
Exactly. Yeah. And my shelf probably has more books from Basic Fantasy. Actually, definitely has more books from Basic Fantasy than any other system, simply by the nature of the pricing and everything that you put on. For those who don't know, all the books are basically sold at cost, I believe. And there's a few different places you can get them from. But then if you're a person who isn't sure on the system, and you're not sure if you want to buy a book, the books have a nice little message on the back of them, which I'll let you tell people what's written on the back of the book.
Don't buy this book.
And
everyone of them has said that since the beginning. I give away. We don't just give away, like some do, the undecorated documents. Well, you don't just give away PDFs. We share the open document format, master copies of everything with art inserted. That doesn't mean that it's easy to make your own modifications. Anybody who's ever worked with a word processor and art understands that it can be frustrating, but which is one of the reasons why final production tends to be time consuming. But if you want to build your own house rules and use them for yourself, even if you want to build products and sell them, we allow that. It doesn't happen a lot in terms of the selling part, because we make it so attractive for contributors to just join the project and participate. And most people at our level anyway understand that it is difficult to make this a profit-making operation. Maybe to make some profit, but to make a useful profit, and I've got a day job. I'm happy. I don't need to make money off of it, and I attract people who are in the same boat, who don't feel the need to make money off of it, who just want to share the joy of what they're creating.
Yeah, and one thing I really appreciate too, besides the fact that it's the full product with the art and everything else in there, something that maybe might slide by most people. But besides having the PDFs there, like you said, you have all the open documents, and that you're using a format like that. Again, kind of going back to the whole open source nature of things, is that anybody can grab this document and without having to buy additional editing tools,
Right.
They can contribute and go that route, which is really nice.
We've lowered the barrier to entry just as low as we can.
Exactly.
I can't walk around handing out computers to people or giving them internet access, but I can do the next best thing. I can make everything depend on tools that everyone can afford because they're free.
Exactly. And I mean, hey, we're not quite at the point where the Raspberry Pi is cheap enough that everybody can go and get one for free, but it's getting close.
Can't even get those things right now.
No, I feel bad because I've got like 4 of them floating around my house that I'm not actively using, which I should be, because
I'm using one for a clock in my office.
Speaking of projects that you've got going on, I had put out a note to one of the Discords I'm on, mentioning that I was going to have this conversation with you, and I said, hey, does anybody have any pressing questions they had for Chris? And one of the ones that came in was about Iron Falcon, which for folks that don't know what Iron Falcon is, it's basically an OD&D clone. Is that fair?
I can't answer that question.
Okay, it's a game heavily inspired by the very first most popular role-playing game.
Yeah,
maybe it's a way of putting it. But
I tell people to think 1975
after Grey,
and that gives them the idea. Well, yeah. OGL rules clause 7 says that I can't name other games in comparison to mine without violating their rules. Without a separate agreement. I have a separate agreement with Matt Finch, Stuart Marshall, and Dan Proctor with respect to their games and Basic Fantasy. So I can talk to you about how Labyrinth Lord and Basic Fantasy relate to each other. I can talk to you about how different Osric is, or how the saving throws are way different between my game and Swords and Wizardry, because I have separate agreements with the people who own the product identity for those games. And I have a similar separate agreement with Simon Bull and Cameron De Beers of Delving Deeper with respect to their game versus Iron Falcon. So I can compare those two games and tell you what's different. I can tell you what's different is they're in 1974 and I'm in 1975, and it's amazing how much difference a year makes.
I bet.
And if I wanted to play the way the game was in 1974, I would be using Delving Deeper. But that wasn't my target when I created Iron Falcon. And I've told this story before, but I'll tell it to you anyway. This came up and it actually, I said this to somebody, and then it started getting around that I created Iron Falcon out of spite, and people took that to mean that I was really, really pissed off when I did it, and I was really, really angry at somebody, that I felt like I'd been horribly abused and so forth and so forth. They took spite a lot more seriously than I meant it when I said it. But it is true. When Basic Fantasy was created in 2006, and in that same year, Osric was first released, and I believe, I'm not sure if Swords and Wizardry made it out till the next year.
I think it was next year, yeah.
Yeah, and Labyrinth Lord was in there somewhere too, but they all came out within that 2-year span. And for a few minutes there, anyway, we were it. Those 4 games for a while were all the OSR there was, and the term OSR hadn't quite yet been coined. And the term retro clone cropped up as a way to describe the games. The Dragon's Foot people, I was on Dragon's Foot at the time. That was actually where the game was first born. Was on the forums of Dragon's Foot, rejected the term retro clone, didn't like it. So they have a Simulacrum Games forum, which was another way of putting it, I suppose. But yeah, I'm still a moderator over there. I hardly ever have occasion to be on the site anymore. But that's where it all started. And retro clone, and all 4 of those games were recognized as retro clones. Well, back around 2000, I think it was 14 or 15, whichever year the first copyright date is on Iron Falcon, I had somebody mention something about Wikipedia's page about retro clones. So I went and looked, and I discovered Basic Fantasy was mentioned as not being one. And I'm I'm stunned. And well, they moved the goalposts. In the interim, in all those years in between there, enough other games had come along that the term retroclone had been shaved down to only refer to games that cloned a specific edition to some arbitrary level of completeness. And because Basic Fantasy didn't match any specific edition quite closely enough, it got ejected from the class. And that made me mad. It didn't make me hugely mad. It made me annoyed. And about the same time, I had been really curious about the genesis of the game, where the things came from. And so I decided that was the target. I was going to go for the first recognizable version of the world's most popular role-playing game. And after doing the research and talking extensively with Simon Bowl in particular, he helped me understand a lot of things. I grasped what made the game what it was and what changes brought it to the 1975 level. And I wrote Iron Falcon in just a little over a month by myself.
Still in an active development, or is it do you consider it a complete game, or is it something that's always going to be tinkered with over?
Well, okay, so Iron Falcon is like Basic Fantasy, is not going to undergo any significant changes. Basic Fantasy, people say, oh, it's third edition. Now, what did you change between first and second? And well, between first and second, we fixed the maneuverability rules, and we fixed the wrestling system, and we corrected some misuses of English. And we put new art on the outside. Between second and third, we added a handful of monsters, a page full of traps, and not much else. Changed a few words that were wrong. And I'm still looking at a very, very few errors, because it's amazing. No matter what you do, there's always a few errors. Maybe bringing out a new release number, but not bumping the edition is going to stay third. People act like we're doing what the major name brand does and creating a brand new game every time we change the edition number, but that's not what we do. You could bring your first edition books to the table and be just fine if you've got them. Hardly anybody has a first edition book unless they bought the I actually had somebody ask me about re-releasing the first edition hardback, so it's available. You can actually buy the first edition hardback still, but on Lulu.
Yeah, but, mine are all the third edition, but actually I've never even gone back to see how significant, or I guess obviously it's going to be clearly significant, but what was the art on the front of the first edition?
The Scribbled Dragon by Eric Wilson.
Okay.
When I was starting on the game development, I did not anticipate being able to get color art. And I had been working with Eric on Dragon's Foot projects. And he'd sent me a handful of art pieces for use with Dragon's Foot projects that he didn't have any particular intention with. And one was the Scribbled Dragon, which is really technically actually a wyvern, or wyvern if you prefer that pronunciation. I prefer wyvern. But anyway, how do you, I don't understand it. How do you scribble a dragon? How do you just start scribbling and end up with
I don't know how anybody draws anything. I have the artistic talent of like a gnat.
There you go. But anyway, this is one of the pieces of art that he submitted, and I contacted him and I told him about the Basic Fantasy project that I was just starting at the time. And I said, do you mind if I use this as the logo for the game? And it's on the title page. It's ghosted on the back of the contents page, I think. And it was on the cover of the first edition. Just plain white cover with black and purple crenellated border around the outside, the same crenellated border we're still using. But it's a white front basically with that logo on it and the name of the game and so forth. That kind of artistic, stuff, I just wasn't prepared for. The title, the cover art on the current version, I asked Eric if he would do me a color cover, and he agreed to do one for me a few years later when we were bringing the second edition out. And we had already talked about what I liked about the Scribbled Dragon as a logo for the game. The Scribbled Dragon is literally just a scribble that looks like a wyvern. It just kind of has a kind of a fast and loose look to it, kind of house rules, as it were. The idea was not that it is house rules, but rather it's a game that likes house rules. It likes it when you make stuff up and do it yourself. And so he did the color version with the same artistic style in mind, with the same fast and loose look to it. At a glance, it's obviously a dragon sitting on its treasure, breathing fire. But as you look at it, you realize that every bit of it's very sketchy.
Right.
It's a beautiful piece, and I've loved it since he sent it to me. So that's kind of how things went. Yeah.
I definitely want to come back to art here in a second because I've got a really what I think might be an interesting, or I want to hear your opinion on an art question. But to go back very quickly to the Iron Falcon, though, still actively being worked on.
The game itself, the rules themselves are not being worked on, except there are a small handful of errata that I'm hoping to stamp out with a new release sometime soon. But one of the things I found when I started trying to write adventures for Iron Falcon is just how limiting a monster list from 1975 was. Many things that we think have always been there hadn't been invented yet. Shriekers, for example. How many times have you built a dungeon room and stuck some shriekers in it because, you need something in there to call the attention of whatever monster lives next door? And they're not in there. So I found myself having to actually insert information about how the monster works into adventures, which I've done. But I'm working on what I'm calling the Iron Falcon Handbook of Monsters. Been working on it for a couple of years now, and I'm hoping to get it out before Christmas.
Oh, there you go.
The Handbook of Monsters is intended to cover every monster you would need to run any classic adventure. Now, that means that covers the 0E era. It covers the 1E era. It should have something to fill every spot. For creatures that are product identity, I have tried to sub in work-alike monsters that stay within the product identity rules. Much as we did with basic fantasy for a few monsters. Everybody does it. It's what has to be done. You can't put
you can't have a beholder in your game.
You can't put those creatures in your game if they're marked as product identity. So that's what you have to work around. But that's what the Handbook of Monsters is intended to do. It provides the statistics in the form used in Iron Falcon. And it is intended to be used with Iron Falcon, but also with basically any other game from that era. It would work just fine with Delving Deeper. It would work just fine with basically any of the slightly more modern retro clones, the ones from the 80s, as it were, with just an adjustment to the armor class and adaptation for your saving throws or whatever. Each game has its own way of handling these things.
Right.
But the handbook is intended to fill in every blank. It's intended to cover everything that you would need to run classic adventures in whatever retro clone that you want to run, and have explanations of their powers and abilities and statistics and so forth at hand. Intended as a resource for creating adventures, of course, just as much as running them. I don't know how well it's going to sell, but I'm looking forward to getting it out, and I'm looking forward to having it in my arsenal to make writing adventures for Iron Falcons easier. Of course, we have one adventure book that's been out since the beginning.
Right.
I am very proud of a couple of the adventures in that book. I have run them before and had bizarre results. Temple of Fear and Madness. I am so happy with that one. Although I can't run it at conventions. The dungeon map is too complicated to work out on a convention map. I did run the Dragon of Doncaster, which I think is fantastic. I just love that. I'm blowing my own horn here. So you can call me full of myself if you want to, but I did write both those adventures basically entirely myself, and I really like them. Although the only times I've ever run Dragon of Doncaster, the players have gotten it sideways every time.
Well, that's what players do.
Well, there's getting it sideways, and then there's getting it sideways. The first time I ran it, the party literally fell apart. They couldn't decide which faction to follow, or run from, or run towards, whatever. It was hilarious and sad.
For folks that aren't aware, so Iron Falcon Adventures Volume 1, very similar to how Basic Fantasy has these anthologies of adventures where you've got 3 to 4 or more adventures in a single book. I've got, like I said, I've got all of them for Basic Fantasy, and it's great. With which game do you find you bring to the table more often? Are you more of a play when you get to play? I don't know how often you get to play, but are you playing Basic Fantasy more often, or Iron Falcon, or is it depends on the group? Or
my in-person game is uniformly been Basic Fantasy for some time. We had a long hiatus because of what.
Yeah.
But we're back at it again. It's been Basic Fantasy all along. Since around 2008, we actually didn't switch the game over till 2007 or 2008. and maybe 2007. I don't know, but we didn't switch the game over right away. We continued to run the older house rules that I'd been using with that group, but they've been doing it since then. I started an online game during you know what, and after a lot of shuffling, I'm down to 5 fairly reliable players who are on some of our YouTube videos. That's that group. I don't record nearly every game that we run. The editing is way too much work to get them the way I want them. In fact, I've got some in the queue that I need to get back to work on that are from a year ago. So that tells you how fast I'm doing it. But yeah, we play, and have played Basic Fantasy mostly. And that gets around to one of the primary reasons why I got on here with you. Besides the Iron Falcon Handbook of Monsters, I have another Iron Falcon project that I've been working on for a while that I am still not quite ready to reveal. I've play tested this. It's an adventure series with a few rules of its own, but it's meant to work with Iron Falcon. I'm hoping that I can get literally the last handful of rooms stocked and get it put out about the same time as the handbook in time for Christmas, I hope. My online group has play tested it. My in-person group has play tested it, and I've actually run it at a couple of conventions with good results every time. So I'm really looking forward to getting it out there. It changes the whole way you play the game. And it's probably not for everyone, but I have to say it's been great fun for me. And that's just on the Iron Falcon side. Now I'm gonna say something about this. You talked about how Basic Fantasy is open source. Iron Falcon isn't. I only give away PDFs. I do make a profit, although it's still not nearly the profit level of the big guys. But I do make a profit on Iron Falcon products. They are entirely or almost entirely my work. I have a few contributors who have, in one way or another, been compensated, but they are actually for-profit items. I pay for my artwork and everything. It's a legit quote-unquote business, if a tiny one. Basic Fantasy is sold very near to cost, not at cost, but very, very close to cost. I make cents on each thing that prints. So it's not a huge amount. And the only reason I make anything on it at all is because it's damn near impossible to make no money when you're publishing through Amazon. And I need to make some to cover costs and so forth. Although they're not onerous. The costs aren't bad for running a project like this. Mostly time, and that's one thing that's hard to deal with. But
that's the hardest thing to have.
That's the hardest thing. Well, and that's coming back to Basic Fantasy. I've joked many times, but it's absolutely true. Basic Fantasy is a wonderful scam. It's the best scam I ever came up with. I wrote a rule book, and people write adventures for me.
Yeah, so you put out the free taste, and then everybody goes back and writes all the game.
And I mean, seriously, look at the adventure anthologies. Each of the adventure anthologies has 1 or 2 of my adventures, and a whole bunch of stuff done by other people. And I'm like, yeah, that's the way you do it. And the JN series, JD Neal's 3 adventure books, I still haven't run everything in there. The adventure anthologies, the contest series, I have run most of the contest series adventures now. They were both of the CS1 and CS2 adventure books, which are first and third contest. The second contest didn't work out for publication, but first and third contest, they were designed to be played out on maps that would fit on my battle mats that I take to convention games. So I don't have to teach anybody how to map from the modern players that don't know how to do that. I just do everything on the battle mats and change mats when they change levels.
Yeah,
we're going to do another competition, I think, and the decision on this was preliminarily made today, so you're the first to hear it. We're going to run a 2-layer competition this time. We're going to do a monster competition where people are invited to submit monsters to our forum specifically for this competition, and then we will have a judging where forum members judge the monsters. The winner of the first one will get a small prize. I think we're looking at like $15 on PayPal. That's pretty much how we do it. Out of the promotional fund that that small amount of profit pays for. And then the second phase is I'm gonna release some maps. Probably this time around we're going to use some Dice and Logos maps because who doesn't want to use those?
Yeah, fantastic maps. And he much like how you have, where people can go and just grab something and quickly use it for their game. All those maps are fantastic, and he has a very, very liberal license for them. So
yeah, I do have to be careful to make sure we pick the ones that are available for commercial use, but
exactly,
it's not that big a deal. And I mean, his stuff is just gorgeous. So we're going to put out a second phase of the competition using a set of maps off of his collection. Probably a writing prompt of some kind, and the requirement that every adventure feature the winning monster. And
Redcaps all the way down.
And at least one. Well, but it's going to have to be something novel. It can't be something out of the books. It's something that people have created from scratch. So
we're going to have something interesting with red hat on.
Well, you never know. You never know. It's amazing sometimes what can be interesting. And we're going to see how that turns out. But we're going to requirement that you feature the winning monster, and you have at least one other monster from the competition in your dungeon or in your adventure. Not completely nailed all the details down yet. Probably won't start the first phase of the competition until maybe November at the earliest. So nobody needs to be in a hurry to be planning anything. But that's where I'm at right now. I'm looking at actually, and we'll have a second award for whoever wins the second. Now, you'd think the person who creates the winning monster would know how to use it best, but that's not guaranteed. So that person's not guaranteed to win both prizes. We'll have to see how that goes.
So folks, you've got 2 calls to action. Then you have to watch the Iron Falcon site for when both an adventure and a monster manual is going to come out. Which, by the way, is a monster manual, when you release it, is it going to be just a PDF, or are you going to release in print as well?
It's going to be in print. It's going to be in print.
Because I'm trying to stop. It's like a bad Coke habit, but I'm trying to stop from buying systems. But I can't resist monster manuals. I've got the Merry Mushmen I'm not sure if you're familiar with who they are. They created the zine Knock, but they've got a new monster manual coming out. Somebody else whose name is escaping me off the top of my head just did a Kickstarter recently they're redoing like the first half of the monster manual or something with the really detailed explanations on every monster. I don't need these products, but I keep buying them because monsters are cool, and my kid loves it, and I can't not buy them. So yours will be on the list.
You asked a question of me early on that I don't think we ever actually covered. You were talking about projects where people create free worlds.
Yeah, so it's boggled me, but nobody's taken this open source ideal and crowdfunded, almost like. So I don't own all their products. I own a couple of Harn World. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Harn at all. They had the game Harn Master, but they've got a very expansive, cool world. I'm just surprised nobody's taken that same model and made an open source kind of project around that, with how easy it would be to get people. Or maybe
the biggest problem is inspiration. That's the first problem. 2 people who can agree, in principle at least, on how a game ought to work are going to have wildly different ideas about how an adventure area is supposed to work. And that's going to be the problem. You have to find an inspiration that works for a large enough group of people to be able to have a collaborative project that people will want to contribute to and participate in. And the thing about it is, all those published worlds that you mentioned, Mystara, for example, they have the advantage of having been published. Many people consumed them, whether they particularly liked them or not. They got them because, well, Mystara was almost included in a way with the Blue Book Expert set, and then of course they did all those gazetteers and so forth. You got to get past the inspiration problem first of all, and to get something like that set up. And the second thing is, you have to have the right person running it. Open source projects need to have someone at the helm who believes in open source, like I do. I believe in it. I believe in sharing. I do it on a moral basis, which sounds way heavier handed than I meant it when I said it. But not that it's something that I should do, but something that I do because it fulfills my needs and fulfills the needs of the people that I'm working with. You know, we cooperate because cooperating is good.
Right.
And the reason the game made no profit, Basic Fantasy made no profit right up until we went on Amazon, because with Lulu I could. With Lulu, I could say I want no profit margin, and they would do that. And the understanding was that the contributors, if we made a significant profit, I would have to figure out how to pay the contributors, number one. But number two, I never wanted to do that anyway. It was always my intention to have it be available for free as a PDF and as an ODT or equivalent document format, something that people could edit themselves. It was always my intention that it be that way. So that was the deal. And I asked the community's guidance before we went on Amazon, because I realized we would have to make a profit on it. And I needed to get clearance from them, from the contributors, for the amounts of money that I was talking about, small as they were. So, it's always been my goal to build a community, not a game. And that, I think, is the reason why you don't see worlds like that. We have a strict rule against worlds.
Oh, really?
I don't know if you knew that. We have a strict rule against worlds. I will not publish world documents. And the reason I don't publish world documents is because, well, the primary reason is, as yet, no one has come forward with anything really compelling. Now, I say that there is significant campaign world material in our DC1 adventure, in the Dragon Claw adventures. There is some material about the Western Lands campaign world in BF1 Morgansfort, right there from the very beginning. But it is nothing more than a sketch. It is such a sketch that people have wildly different opinions on what exists in various parts of the map, and that's absolutely fine. It was never my intention to create a world that would be strictly defined. Rather, it was my intention to create a world that had lots of places for game masters to stick their own stuff.
Right. I mean, that's kind of the partly the outside of it being kind of a default, like you said at the time, but that's kind of, for me, part of the reason I kind of like Mystara as well is they have a ton of lore and a lot of stuff that's set, but there's so much open space in Mystara that you could stick anything almost anywhere as well. But I do like the idea of what you're saying of almost the map can't be agreed on, because if you want to kind of go down that route of what the people living in that world be, most of them probably wouldn't have a complete map of the world anyway. So,
well, there you go.
Unreliable narrators there and what have you. But
I have run Western Land adventures. I ran some for a while with an in-person group before COVID that met in a nearby town at a game store. Well, I actually had a game store there, and I ran Western Land adventures where I took the JN1 Chaotic Caves adventures and set them 2 days travel to the west of Morgansfort inland, so that it was a good all-around beginning levels campaign that players could go from one area to the other. There are 6 dungeon levels total in the Morgansfort area, and I couldn't even tell you exactly how to count the dungeon levels in the JN1 area. And I had a good time with that. It was a good way to run it. I would, if I was going to start a new campaign right now with a new in-person group of people I barely knew, I would start them at Morgansfort, and I would absolutely place the JN1 material somewhere nearby. It works really well. I wouldn't have to do any significant preparation because it's all there. So yeah, like I said, it's a scam. People write adventures for me.
All right, I've got 2 more questions for you. One that might be controversial, and the other one which I think you'll have an awesome answer for, or at least I believe you probably will. So the first question might be controversial. It's going around all over, anybody who makes a game right now, and it kind of ties into both yours and mine's technical background, is AI art. What's your opinion on AI? Is it a tool? Is it the death to artists, or is it just something that is now the genie's out of the bottle and people are going to have to deal with it? What's your view on AI art overall?
Okay, for starters, I don't have a dog in this fight.
Yeah.
I am not an artist myself. I can draft, but I can't draw. I can't draw anything artistic. And when I say I can draft, I'm referring to relatively simple mechanisms. I could not, for instance, draw a house. Even in drafting, I'm not that skilled. I never did get that good at it.
I
learned it in high school years ago, barely touched it since then, except occasionally when I'm trying to fix something. So I don't really have a dog in that fight. Yeah, the genie is absolutely out of the bottle. for better or for worse, it's got to be dealt with. And we had to see it coming. People
sure.
had to see it was going to happen. I mean, anyone who was blindsided by it wasn't paying attention. Didn't watch enough Star Trek.
Yeah, I mean, I've been using the this person is not real. I think it's the URL for it. It's a website where you can go and it'll generate a random human face. That looks shockingly like a real person, but it's not. I've used those for NPCs now for ages, where it's just like I need a person who's this is what the person looks like. Not obviously, I don't publish any materials or anything like that.
No,
but now with the ability of using some of the various tools out there, it's amazing some of the stuff you can put in, taking like descriptions of the monsters from various monster manuals and just dropping them in as a prompt and seeing the crazy stuff that comes out.
The main problem I have with AI in terms of, in practical terms, my experiences with it, Wombo Dream is a joke. I'm sorry. I feel bad for the Wombo people, but it just doesn't do a very good job, except it did a fantastic tarot playing card Joe Biden the other day for something I was publishing, but I had to trim the bottom off of it because his fingers were horribly mangled and I have no idea why. And the Dolly Mini I've played with, but I'm not even trying to get on Dolly because there's so many people subscribing to it.
Yeah, it's fully open now. I think they removed the whole. I don't think you have to sign up anymore. I think they created so everybody can get in.
I've played with Midjourney extensively. Midjourney is fantastic for a small handful of things and terrible at everything else so far. But it creates some truly, my daughter would call it cursed artwork. It's fun to play with. If I was thoroughly broke and looking at publishing a book of fiction, I have a few fictional books out there actually, but they're not nearly as popular as my game materials. I might break down and use them for a cover. The only piece of artwork I would need, and if I couldn't find a public domain or otherwise freely usable piece of art for the cover that would work, I might fall back to an AI and pay them $10 for the privilege. But I don't know. It's not that great yet, but it'll get there. That's the thing. And people just need to understand we're going to reach that point and people have to adapt to it.
Yeah, I view it. I also have no dog in the fight. I have no ability to draw at all. I guess the dog I have in the fight is that it allows me to quickly get interesting images of things. But the way I view it is I think for those who choose to embrace it a little bit, it'll end up becoming a tool. Whereas if you are a person who's incredibly artistic and can create great things, this would let you prototype faster or maybe get inspiration faster or give you something that you can then incorporate into a digital artwork that you're using and edit over top of almost.
There are too many unsettled rights issues with that. That's the problem with AI art. There's too many unsettled rights issues.
What the training material was for it, what have you.
What the training material was for it, whether or not you can even copyright it because it was created by a machine.
That'll be an interesting topic over the next few years.
Our laws are not there yet. So, and I will say for the record, in case any of my contributors are listening, the Basic Fantasy Project will not use any AI art in any of our productions anytime while I'm in charge.
For that exact reason, I would assume.
Well, rights is a big part of it, but the primary reason is because I have always, as the joke says, depended on the charity of others, the kindness of others. I've been blessed to have artists come in at just the right time and drop wonderful things in my lap to put into our adventures, into our books and so forth. I am not going to undercut our artist community.
Yeah,
by using an AI. Now, I will absolutely use public domain artwork drawn by people 100 years ago. No problem. I got no problem with that. But that's not, and I almost always will prefer a recently drawn piece of art over something like that if I have a choice in the matter. The public domain art is literally space fillers. But I won't use AI art for that. I'm just not going to. It's not going to happen. It's pretty much I'm going to depend on art drawn by human beings, as long as that's my available pool of artists anyway, as human beings. I'm going to depend on that. That's just how it goes. And the same thing goes for Iron Falcon, but for less serious reasons. I mean, as I said, I pay for my artwork for Iron Falcon if it's not public domain, but still, I don't see the point. It doesn't fit the design aesthetic of the game. So there you go.
Okay, and actually, I lied. I have one other question before I get to the final one.
Okay.
And back in the beginning of this whole OSR sphere of games that have come out, it's very clear, and you can hear it just in the way that you talk, that you guys were very conscious about the OGL and how far you could push something without suddenly having a team of lawyers coming knocking on your door.
We were terrified.
Yeah, you guys are very, very conscious about everything that was done over time. And maybe this leans back into the whole thing you mentioned earlier about how you haven't really kept up with the rest of the OSR. It feels like newer games that have been released over the last couple of years seem to almost play with that line willy-nilly.
They're being a lot less cautious, and I will claim for us, not for me, some responsibility for that. We survived without being attacked, and I think that made them feel comfortable.
And with newer editions coming out, so there's been talk about how with what the new edition will be here of D&D, whatever they end up calling it, and whether or not there would be whether those licenses will continue to the newer products and what have you. Is there, without, obviously you're nobody's lawyer, but what would be your word of caution to anybody who's going out to publishing these items, any sort of an OSR product or third party product, in terms of around the licensing and being careful of the words that they use?
The key thing to understand here is that the license, the OGL, the license for the original 3.x, 3.5 SRD, the actual OGL, doesn't have a expiration date. If you're creating a game and you can legitimately use that as a basis for the game, you can actually use it as a legal basis for the use of the terms and maybe even some of the text. Again, as you said, I'm not a lawyer, but that seems like the smartest thing to do because everyone else has done it and everyone else has gotten away with it. I feel like depending on any later or other license, I can't comment on that. If there is another license, if there are later products that have open licenses like that, I can't comment on how they would work because I've never experienced them. So I'm not in a position to discuss it. And anybody with the guts to run around without a license, there are a few out there I'm kind of thinking of. I'm good for them. They may never get challenged. I just don't want to be there. I know where I'm at. For people who join the Basic Fantasy Project, and we're always open to new members who want to contribute stuff for our games, we will take care of sorting out your OGL so that it looks like ours, so that it works like ours, and everything is sorted. We know the things that need to be filled in that are not there in the initial text. A lot of people literally just boilerplate the OGL text at the end of their works without actually reading it. When you read it, there's things you're supposed to do to make it effective, and we make sure that those things are done. But
I've always kind of treated the OGL as a EULA. Since I don't publish anything, it's non-consequential. But yeah, I can see somebody that's looking it over and going.
You're required under the license to identify your product identity. You're required to have text outside the license that identifies what your product identity is, so that the license can then protect it.
Right.
Number one, if you don't have a section that text before the license or somewhere around the license that explains this, you're not keeping it up. The second thing is you're required to add your copyright to the end of the list of copyrights at the end of the license to verify that you're part of that. You're supposed to add that to the very end. And the licenses of any other products that you've borrowed from need to be repeated there in full. And I run into products every now and then, free downloads. I'll admit, with as many adventures as we have, I still sometimes need a little extra. And I'll go looking for adventures written for other games, and I'll run across them sometimes where the OGL is just not all there. And it's not my place to tell these people, but it doesn't seem like a good idea to me. That's my word of caution. Read their license, understand what it says, engage a lawyer if you think you need to. I'm comfortable where I am, and I think it's a good place to be.
That's good advice. There's several folks that listen to this podcast I know are currently in their own process of creating games, specifically like chainmail type games, that'll end up using certain portions of that license, I'm sure. So that's good information for them to hear as well. All right. So the last question I've got is, why should people be playing Basic Fantasy or any of these games from this era as opposed to games now? What is the appeal to you, and what would you suggest would be?
You want me to talk about modern games versus old school?
No. I don't want the addition more. I'm more saying, what would be your pitch to have somebody come and play?
But that's the whole point. You're actually what you're asking is the important thing. Most modern published games are built under the assumption that the game master is going to operate as the CPU of a computer, executing the code written in the book verbatim, the way it was written, rules as written. That's raw. I hear that all the time, and it makes me irritated. But raw, you run the game the way it's written. Modern games tend to be, and I can't say this for the most recent versions because I haven't read them in detail, but most modern games tend to be written in a very prescriptive fashion, with detailed results for every possibility that they could possibly think of, and total confusion if they miss a corner case somewhere. That's how they're written. The old school games, whether they're actually written in the old days or they're written now, but with an old school bent, are written to use the game master's fiat. The rules are left with holes in them. They're left loose to allow the game master to make reasonable decisions about how the game should work for his or her player group and for his or her campaign. You make those decisions for yourself. And the thing about this is, this is how I believe this works. That was how the game started. The game started that way because old school war games that the role-playing games rose up out of were built that way. The war game community understood that in general you couldn't write too detailed a war game and have people be able to remember it all. So they had a referee whose job it was to make decisions about how the rules worked in whatever odd cases one player or the other might find in a war game scenario. And the same thing applied in role-playing games. The original game called the game master referee before they started with the dungeon master term. So there you go. The whole thing started that way. The advantage of that is if you have a good game master and you have a game that has proper fiat, that is an old school game that's designed for the game master to make rulings. I don't particularly like the phrase rulings, not rules, but that's what we're talking about here. If you've got a good game master, you're going to have a fantastic game. The loose structure of the old games allows a good game master to really shine, to really show his or her skills at whatever it is that they're good at that makes their players happy. And different player groups have different ideas. But this is the thing that allows you to do that. If you want to focus on tactical things, you can get gritty with stuff if you want to. And if your players like that kind of thing, great. If your players are going to spend 2/3 of their session in town negotiating with NPCs and you're good at playing NPCs, great. It allows a game master to shine at whatever he or she is good at. The problem with it is if the game master sucks, the game sucks. Making the games more prescriptive, the way modern games are written, means that the game master is limited in how bad they can be. Because the rules say this is what happens in this odd case, and the players find that rule and they say, well, the stupid thing that you wanted to do doesn't work, game master, because here it says in the rules that that's not how it works. They got a rule to cover everything that could possibly happen, and the game master faithfully follows that rule. Even if he or she's not a very good game master, the game can only be just so crappy. But the problem with that is it also ties the hands of the really good game master who, without the ability to make rulings on the fly that may be different from what the rule book says because the players are going to call them on it, it's difficult to really shine. It's difficult to go with it when something happens that makes it obvious to you that the whatever story you thought was happening is not the story that was happening and you need to do something different. You have much more flexibility in an old school game than you do in a new school game. I really feel like the simple fact of the matter that so many game masters weren't very good is what led us into the situation where modern games are like they are. And it's also why old experienced game masters tend to rebel against them. We don't like having our hands tied. We think we think we know what we're doing, and we want to do it the way we want to do it. And having a game tell us that we're not allowed to do that is not acceptable.
So it's almost as if the newer style games have a higher floor but a much lower but a cap ceiling on creativity, whereas the older school games, the way you've described it, infinite floor and infinite ceiling on how bad or how good something could be.
That's roughly accurate. That's more or less where I was going with that. Yeah, and to clarify for those who might be listening to this, this is just my opinion. I don't want to get into a flame war with anybody over this stuff, but this is what I've seen. This is how it looks to me. And again, I haven't looked at the most modern releases very closely, so I don't know if that's still true or not. But from what I've been hearing from my daughter, who plays a more modern game, I think it's still pretty much that way. Game masters can't be too bad, but they're not really allowed to be real good either. There's just a limit. Certain things are always going to be good. If you can play NPCs good, I'm not that great. If you can play NPCs good, it doesn't matter what kind of game system you're running. But there you go.
Yeah, people always love a good character to role play off of, regardless of whether that's a good or an evil character. If you can convincingly create somebody that's not you.
I think I'm better at that than I used to be, but I still don't consider myself good.
I have no ability to do voices, so if I can get people to ignore the fact that it's still my voice coming at them, then the NPCs are all right. But
yes. When I find myself in my online game in the position of having to speak for Yvain Leandra D'Angelo Corden, Duchess Tarkin, that's her name.
That's a mouthful.
Yvain Leandra D'Angelo Tarkin. She uses her mother's maiden name, D'Angelo, because that is a really, really well-known family in my campaign world of wizards. And Corden, which is her proper family name, her father's name, isn't that big a deal. They're a small, minor, noble house. So hanging on to that name makes her feel better about herself. And then it's tradition in that particular kingdom that the dukes and duchesses give their title and house last. So Duchess Tarkin comes at the end. And yeah, it is a mouthful, but she is, God, I don't even know the words to describe her personality. And I do not have the voice. I do not have the voice for this cultured, self-important woman. As high as her position is, Duchess Tarkin, Duke Tarkin is one of the most powerful dukes in the kingdom. But even as high as she is, she still feels the constant need to elevate herself. And I can't do that voice. My players just have to live with that fact. But they still get the point. I think they still understand what kind of a person she is. Or the elf legate, and I cannot think of her name right now. In the same city. Doing her voice is just as far beyond me as the Duchess. But you do what you got to do. I am pretty good at doing stupid orcs, but who isn't, right?
Yep. All right, so we're coming up onto an hour. So let's pitch all your things. So tell everybody where they get involved with the projects if they want to, where they get the projects. Give them all the links. I'll have them all linked in the description as well. But sure. Tell everybody all the things.
The number one thing is Basic Fantasy. www.basicfantasy.org. There's a link there for the forum, which is where we do everything. There's a button right at the top of the page that'll take you to a separate page that lists everything we have in print and everywhere you can get it. I think it's currently up to date as of this year. So anyway, all the stuff we have available for sale is also available for download. There's not a single thing held back. So you can pick all that stuff up off our downloads page. We have a Discord linked from basicfantasy.org over to the Discord. It's gotten pretty active lately, actually. We have a Facebook group that's moderately active. All that stuff is linked from the homepage. Iron Falcon is found at ironfalconrpg.com. Again, while there's not nearly as much material there, links to the items for sale and links to the PDF downloads that are available are there. While I don't give away the original documents for Iron Falcon, I do give away the PDFs. You can absolutely read the entire rule set, look at everything before you decide if you want to buy a copy or not. And I will announce there's a section of the forum on basicfantasy.org that actually covers Iron Falcon. I don't have a separate forum for that. So when I announce print releases for either game or new stuff for either game, it'll be on the main forum. I do everything on the forum. If you want to ask a question, I get this all the time emailed. When is such and such coming out in print, or is such and such coming out in print? You want the answer, go to the forum, find the thread where we're designing the thing, because whatever the thing is, the thing has a thread and we are talking about it. And you can figure out pretty quick whether we're close to printing it or not. Everything is out. I'm not saying people shouldn't contact me. You got a question, you want to say something to me, contact me. That's fine. But I'm just saying, anybody that asks me when something's coming out, I'm going to send them to the forum. So that's it. Yeah. And the print works are available. Pretty much everything's available on Lulu and Amazon, and a few things are available on DriveThruRPG. I have a lot of trouble with Lightning Source, which is their current printing company, so I just haven't gone through the trouble of making most things available. But the rule books for both games are out there. So
good stuff. And yeah, and everybody needs to make sure they keep an eye on that forum as well, just for the contest you mentioned and the release of the other products that'll hopefully be coming out this year.
Thank you,
Chris. I couldn't thank you enough for agreeing to come on to this little Rinky Dink podcast. But it's awesome having the creator of the game that like I said, I've recommended more than any other game. Second episode of the podcast is all about basic fantasy. Love the project, loved everything that you've done with it, and just thank you very so much for coming on and talking with us.
Thank you. Hey, if you have a chance to talk to anybody else in the community, I'll recommend all three of those guys I was talking about: Dan Proctor, Stuart Marshall, and Matt Finch. But I tell you, especially if you get a chance to talk to Stuart Marshall sometime, you should do it. Ask him what he did to make sure his game was legal.
All right, I will.
He was way deeper into it than I was, and I can't even begin to tell his story.
All right, well, Chris, thank you very much. And again, everybody, please go check out everything to do with Basic Fantasy and Iron Falcon.
All right, folks, that wraps up this episode of the Redcaps Podcast. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and that you're going to go check out all that cool stuff that Chris was talking about. The phone number to call in is open. It is 385-2REDCAP. That's 385-273-3227. Or if you are not in the US or don't wish to call by phone, you can head over to anchor.fm/theredcaps, and you can leave a voicemail via the website there. www.theredcaps.net has all the links to all the things and all the ways to contact me, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you very so much for listening, and remember, never let your cap dry out. Stay safe, have fun, we'll talk again soon.